10 secret government projects that changed everything, a ship built to steal a submarine, a computer erased from history, an aircraft designed to make radar see nothing, and a secret city where ordinary workers helped build the most dangerous weapon ever made, without even knowing what they were building. None of this was invented in a garage. These were projects built behind fences, funded through cover stories, and protected by people who couldn't even tell their own families what they did all day. So here's the question to keep in your head as we count down: how much of the modern world was built on secrets that were never supposed to come out? Let's get right to the point. Number 10, Project Azorian, the underwater heist. In 1968, a Soviet submarine carrying nuclear weapons vanished beneath the Pacific Ocean. The Soviets searched for it. They couldn't find it. But the Americans did. It was sitting more than 3 miles underwater, which is already a nightmare, past the point where light can reach. At that depth, the ocean isn't just water. It's pressure, darkness, and metal-crushing weight. For reference, the tiny experimental carbon fiber and titanium tourist submersible that suffered a catastrophic implosion on June 18, 2023, killing all 5 people on board in about a millisecond during a descent, was only about 2.4 miles deep when it imploded near the wreckage of the Titanic. Recovering anything from down there is hard. Recovering an entire submarine without Moscow noticing sounds ridiculous, so the CIA tried it anyway. They went to Howard Hughes and borrowed his name for a cover story. A giant ship called the Glomar Explorer would supposedly mine minerals from the ocean floor, but hidden inside the ship was something much stranger, a massive mechanical claw nicknamed Clementine. The CIA's whole grand plan was basically the equivalent of a giant version of one of those arcade claw machine games that you always lose. The goal was simple: drop a multi-pronged mechanical grabber from above, center it over a target, clamp the jaws closed, and hoist the prize straight up. In 1974, with Soviet ships nearby, the claw descended, grabbed part of the submarine, and started lifting. Operators on the ship could not look out a window to see what they were doing. They had to control the claw using a small array of underwater lights and early television cameras. Unlike the arcade machine, the claw could not simply drive left or right on a track. The ship itself had to use a groundbreaking dynamic positioning system using satellite navigation and underwater acoustic transponders to stay perfectly still over the target in rough open ocean currents. An arcade claw hangs from a loose string or cable, which would have snapped or tangled at 1,600 feet. Instead, Clementine was attached to a rigid, 3-mile-long steel pipe string that had to be screwed together piece by piece. Just like a frustrating arcade game where the prize slips out of the claw's grasp halfway up, the metal fingers of Clementine suffered a catastrophic structural failure, causing the heaviest part of the submarine to slip out and crash back to the ocean floor. Talk about rigged. So no, it wasn't a perfect success, but the fact that it worked at all was insane. And when reporters later asked the government to confirm the mission, officials wouldn't say yes or no. That non-answer became known as the Glomar response. A phrase now tied to freedom of information law was born from a secret submarine claw. Before Project Azorian, nobody had ever tried to lift anything that heavy from that deep. The mission pushed dynamic positioning, heavy load seafloor engineering, and deep ocean metallurgy forward hard, some of it invented for the job, some of it proven at a scale nobody had attempted before. That work fed straight into the deep sea drilling rigs and underwater recovery vehicles still working today. Next up is something much deeper and darker, where the government didn't try to steal from the ocean. It tried to reach inside the human mind. Number 9, MKUltra, the search for mind control. Imagine checking into a hospital seeking help for postpartum depression, only to be forced into a chemical coma for 30 days straight. You wake up 13 pounds lighter. You don't know your own name. You don't recognize your children. You have to relearn how to walk and use the bathroom because a doctor, funded by your own government, has completely erased your mind. That is not a hypothetical. That is close to what real women walked out of a real Montreal hospital describing, decades before anyone told them why. That was the nightmare behind MKUltra. During the Cold War, American officials were terrified that hostile governments had discovered ways to break minds and force prisoners to talk. So, the CIA did the only normal thing any sane and rational group of persons would do, given the situation. They went looking for that same power, and they turned American and Canadian citizens into lab rats to find it. Under MKUltra, the CIA completely abandoned human decency. At the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, psychiatrist Dr. Ewan Cameron spearheaded a horrific practice called de-patterning. He subjected unwitting patients to electroshock therapy at up to 40 times the normal voltage. To break a patient down, Cameron took their deepest insecurities, traumas, and flaws, often confessed to him during private therapy sessions, and turned them into weapons. He locked helmets onto the heads of unconscious patients, forcing audio messages to play on a loop, by some accounts, as many as 500,000 times in a brutal attempt to overwrite their personalities. Things like, "You are a bad mother and a terrible wife. You are inadequate and everyone knows it. Your husband does not love you because of how you act. You killed your mother. These were referred to as the negative driving phase. Once the patient was completely broken, often heavily drugged, incontinent, and suffering from severe amnesia due to the electroshock, Cameron switched the tapes to the positive driving phase. This was his attempt to overwrite their erased personality with a new, compliant one. These messages included forced affirmations like, "You are a confident person. You can cope with your life and your family. You are relaxed and in control of your emotions." But the cruelty extended far beyond hospitals. The CIA aggressively targeted the most vulnerable people in society, prisoners, sex workers, and those experiencing addiction. At a federal facility in Lexington, Kentucky, researchers found a captive audience of patients seeking treatment for drug addiction. They were bribed with the very drug they were trying to escape, offered heroin in exchange for participating in LSD experiments. On paper, that research ran through public health channels. In practice, the CIA funded work like this and took an extremely close interest in what came out of it. In one terrifying trial, a doctor named Harris Isbell kept 7 men hallucinating on LSD for 77 consecutive days. This wasn't just 77 days of vibrant colors, cool cloud shapes, and morphing surfaces. This was pure torture. The goal of the experiment was to see if a person could be kept in a perpetual, unbreakable state of LSD-induced psychosis. However, the human body builds a rapid tolerance to LSD. By the second or third day, the initial doses stopped causing severe hallucinations. Instead of stopping the experiment, Isbell simply increased the dosage, doubling, tripling, and quadrupling the amount of LSD he pumped into these men. At points, they were being given massive, mind-shattering doses of up to 600 micrograms just to force their brains to keep hallucinating. Because the CIA destroyed the bulk of MKUltra files, and Isbell's own published papers were sterile and clinical, we don't have the personal diary entries of these 7 men. But Isbell's clinical notes reveal the sheer terror they experienced. During the experiment, the men suffered extreme paranoia, anxiety, and dissociation. In one documented instance from Isbell's trials, a subject had such a severe negative reaction to the LSD that he begged to drop out, convinced that he was either going to physically die or become permanently insane. Because he was a prisoner, his pleas were denied. Isbell noted that the man required considerable persuasion to continue. They were kept in a segregated ward, trapped in a continuous, artificially induced nightmare for 2.5 months. Isbell, devoid of empathy for their suffering, simply wrote in his notes that the 77-day trial was, and I quote, "the most amazing demonstration of drug tolerance I have ever seen." Then there's Operation Midnight Climax, a name that sounds less like a top-secret government project and more like a cheap 1970s adult film. In Operation Midnight Climax, the CIA set up secret safe houses in San Francisco and New York. They hired sex workers to lure unsuspecting men inside, secretly slipping massive, unmeasured doses of LSD into their drinks while federal agents watched the horrifying, paranoid results through two-way mirrors. As you can tell, they really liked their LSD experiments during this time. The stated official purpose of Operation Midnight Climax was to see if a combination of sex, alcohol, and mind-altering drugs could be used to extract state secrets from Soviet spies, or to create situations where foreign diplomats could be blackmailed. But the reality was that it quickly devolved into bizarre, government-funded voyeurism. The agents would sit back and take notes as the unsuspecting men transitioned from a sexual encounter into terrifying, drug-induced panic attacks, paranoia, and psychotic breaks. Some men fled the apartments into the streets of San Francisco while completely out of their minds. Because these men were engaging with illegal sex workers and were sometimes married, the CIA knew they would be too ashamed or terrified to ever go to the police. It was the perfect trap. Even inside federal prison, there was no escape. Notorious mobster Whitey Bulger was serving time in the Atlanta penitentiary when he signed up for what he was told was research into a cure for schizophrenia in exchange for time off his sentence. What he actually got was the CIA's favorite drug of choice. By his own account, he was dosed with LSD more than 50 times. He later described the horror. "We experienced horrible periods of living nightmares and even blood coming out of the walls. Guys turning to skeletons in front of me." Those are his words, from letters he wrote decades later. The paperwork that could have confirmed the details had already been destroyed by the time anyone thought to go looking for it. Nobody was safe from the experiments, not even the government's own people. In 1953, American Army biochemist Frank Olson was secretly dosed with LSD by his CIA supervisor during a work retreat. Okay, pause. Seriously, what was with the CIA's obsession with LSD? Haven't they ever heard of MDMA? If you want a Soviet spy to spill his guts, you don't need psychological torture. Just give him some Molly, put on some techno, and wait 20 minutes. He'll tell you all his state secrets, and then he'll hug you and tell you your aura is beautiful. Anyways, back to the biochemist Frank Olson. Plunged into a severe psychotic break, Olson fell to his death from a 10th-story hotel window just days later. It was a tragedy the government spent decades trying to cover up. And here's the part people often misunderstand. MKUltra didn't create reliable mind control. That's the myth. Allegedly. The real story is darker. The program crossed enormous ethical lines, permanently destroyed innocent minds, and still failed to get what its creators wanted. To make it worse, when the walls started closing in around 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the MKUltra files destroyed. A batch of financial records got misfiled and survived the shredder. That accident is the only reason we know as much as we do, which means the terminal cancer patients, the marginalized citizens, and the thousands of broken minds we know about are only the ones who happen to show up on a receipt. The full, unvarnished truth was burned. MKUltra didn't change the world by mastering the mind. It changed the world by showing what happens when fear, power, and absolute secrecy remove every normal rule. Number 8, Operation Paperclip, the scientists with a past. As the Second World War ended, American and Soviet forces raced across Germany. But they weren't only racing for land, they were racing for people. Nazi Germany had built advanced rockets, aircraft, and guided missiles. As the war ended, both the United States and the Soviet Union wanted the scientists who knew how those machines worked. Because if late-night History Channel documentaries are to be believed, the Nazis had just finished building a time machine powered by secret alien technology. But back in reality, they hadn't found aliens. They had just built the world's first ballistic missiles, and the United States wanted them. But there was a very uncomfortable problem. Many of those scientists hadn't just worked for the Nazi regime. Some were Nazi party members. Some, including the most famous name on this entire list, held rank in the SS. Under Operation Paperclip, the US government decided that winning the Cold War was more important than justice. They quietly brought over 1,600 German specialists to the United States. To sneak them past President Truman's strict anti-Nazi rules, intelligence officers actively scrubbed their records, literally paperclipping fake, clean biographies over their real files. That's how the operation got its name. The most famous was Wernher von Braun. He was a lead engineer on the Nazi V-2 rocket program. Years later, he became the smiling face of NASA, helping build the Saturn V rocket that sent Americans to the moon. But here is what the history books usually leave out. Von Braun's Nazi rockets were built inside the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. Around 20,000 enslaved prisoners were worked to death, starved, or hanged from cranes in disease-ridden underground tunnels to build his machines. In fact, more people died building the V-2 rockets than were actually killed by them exploding in London. And it wasn't just rocket engineers. The US brought over men like Dr. Hubertus Strughold, who became the father of space medicine for NASA, despite the wartime institute he ran being linked to horrific freezing and oxygen deprivation experiments on prisoners at Dachau. Strughold denied knowing anything about it for the rest of his life, and historians still argue over how much he knew. What nobody argues about is that the experiments happened, and that decades later, his name was quietly stripped off an award because of them. That's the part that still feels sickening. Men who built their careers in the shadow of Holocaust victims were given American citizenship, high-paying government salaries, and prestigious medals. Operation Paperclip is uncomfortable because it worked. And because it worked, it forced a question no government likes answering out loud. How much of a monster's past will a country cover up when it badly wants what's inside their head? Number 7, Colossus, the computer that vanished. When you hear about British codebreakers in World War II, you probably think of Alan Turing cracking the Enigma machine. But that was for day-to-day military chatter. For the really important stuff, the top secret, personal messages between Adolf Hitler and his highest-ranking generals, the Nazis used an encryption machine that was infinitely more complex. So, an engineer named Tommy Flowers poured his own money into building something completely new. Inside Bletchley Park in England, paper tape ripped through a machine packed with switches, wires, and glowing electronic valves. Its name was Colossus. Its job wasn't just to crack random codes. It was built to break the Lorenz cipher, the impossibly complex encryption used for personal, top-secret messages between Adolf Hitler and his highest-ranking generals. Doing that by hand would take forever. Britain didn't have forever. Tommy Flowers built a programmable electronic machine that could test possible patterns at a speed nobody had seen before. It went live in 1944. It wasn't a general-purpose computer like the ones we use now. Nobody was opening spreadsheets, checking email, bragging about using Linux, or getting pop-up ads for hot singles in the Bletchley Park area while trying to watch the movie Gaslight for free. but it processed information electronically at a speed that would have sounded like science fiction only a few years earlier. It gave the Allies the exact intelligence they needed to pull off the D-Day invasion. Before the invasion of Normandy, the Allies set up a fake ghost army of inflatable tanks and wooden planes across the water from Pas de Calais, hoping to trick Hitler into thinking the invasion would happen there instead of Normandy. But they had no way of knowing if Hitler actually bought the lie. Colossus cracked the high-level German traffic that confirmed it. Hitler had fallen for the trick completely and was keeping his best panzer tank divisions parked at Calais. Because of Colossus, General Eisenhower knew it was safe to launch D-Day. Then the war ended, and instead of becoming famous, the people who built Colossus were ordered into silence. The machines were broken up. The instruction that came down was to smash them into pieces no bigger than a man's hand. You'll often hear that Churchill personally gave that order, and it's a great line, but the paper trail doesn't actually back it up. What's certain is that post-war secrecy policy did the job just as thoroughly. Most of the machines were dismantled, the plans were destroyed, and the two that survived were quietly hidden away at GCHQ until the 60s, when they were broken up too. Documents were burned, operators couldn't tell anyone what they had worked on. Not colleagues, not historians, not even their own children. Because of the Official Secrets Act, Tommy Flowers was left in debt from building the machine, and was forced to sit in silence for decades, while American scientists took all the credit for inventing the computer. For half a century, the history of computing had a massive missing chapter, and almost nobody knew it was missing. One of the earliest electronic digital computers helped win a world war. Then, its own government treated it like it had never existed. Now for our next entry, the machine was too big to hide. This one didn't just process information. It wired an entire continent together. Number 6. SAGE, the room-sized network. Picture a command room full of glowing screens. Radar stations hundreds of miles away are feeding data into the system. An operator points a light gun at a blip on the screen, pulls up more information, and helps guide an interceptor toward it. That sounds like a modern military command center, but this was the 1950s. The system was called SAGE, which stood for Semi-Automatic Ground Environment. Its job was simple and terrifying. If Soviet bombers came toward North America, SAGE was supposed to detect them, track them, and coordinate a response before nuclear weapons landed. The computers were enormous. A single machine weighed about 250 tons and could fill a building, but size wasn't the real breakthrough. The breakthrough was connection. SAGE linked radar stations, bases, communication lines, computers, and human operators into one continuous real-time system. That pushed major advances in digital memory, modems, large-scale software, and something we take for granted now, clicking an object on a screen. At the time, that was revolutionary. This may seem trivial, but it paved the way towards the two things that truly define modern civilization: global data networks and getting 360 No scoped across a map by a 12-year-old on Call of Duty. SAGE wasn't the internet, but it proved one of the ideas underneath modern life-distant machines can talk to each other constantly while humans react in real time. Banking, air traffic control, emergency response, even the phone in your pocket all come from that same basic idea. We're halfway through the countdown now, and there's a pattern starting to appear. Every project so far solved a real problem, but each one also crossed a line: a stolen submarine, human experiments, scientists with horrifying pasts, a computer erased from history, a continent wired for nuclear war. And the next 5 projects push that pattern even further, because now the goal changes. It's no longer just about detecting the enemy, it's about disappearing completely. Number 5, OXCART, faster than the threat. In 1960, a Soviet missile shot down an American U-2 spy plane. That changed everything. Before then, flying extremely high seemed like protection, but the shoot-down made the lesson painfully clear. High altitude wasn't safe anymore. So the CIA and Lockheed started building a replacement under a classified program called OXCART. The aircraft became known as the A-12. The goal was almost rude in how ambitious it was. Fly above 90,000 feet at over 2,000 miles per hour. That sounds simple until you remember what air does to an aircraft at that speed. At Mach 3, friction heats the skin of the plane until ordinary metal starts to soften and lose its strength. Fuel becomes a problem, engines become a problem, even the windows become a problem. The cockpit got so hot that pilots had to wear insulated pressure suits just to keep from being cooked alive inside their own jet. Lockheed couldn't just build a faster plane, they had to rethink physics. The aircraft used titanium, special fuel, new engines, and life support systems that made the pilot look less like a flyer and more like an astronaut. And here's the detail that still sounds fake. Much of the world's titanium supply at the time came from the Soviet Union, so America secretly set up shell companies to buy titanium from the Soviets just so they could build a spy plane to fly over and spy on the Soviets. The A-12 flew, and it became the technological ancestor of the SR-71 Blackbird. OXCART proved that a plane could survive by outrunning the threat. If you were flying over enemy territory and someone fired a missile at you, you didn't dodge. You just pushed the throttles forward and left the missile in the dust. But radar and missiles kept improving. Eventually, speed wouldn't be enough. The next aircraft tried something even stranger. It tried to convince radar there was nothing there at all. Number 4, have blue and tacit blue learning to disappear. Radar works a little like shouting into a dark room and listening for the echo. Most aircraft create a loud, obvious echo. So engineers asked a strange question. What if you shaped the plane so the radar energy bounced away instead of bouncing back? That idea led to have blue, and have blue looked bizarre. It was sharp, angular, and awkward, like someone folded a fighter jet out of scrap metal and forgot to make it pretty. But beauty wasn't the point. The shape was designed to redirect radar energy, and it led directly to the F-117 Nighthawk. Because it was made entirely of flat, jagged panels, it was aerodynamically unstable. It fundamentally did not want to fly. It was only possible because they hooked it up to advanced flight computers that made constant micro-adjustments just to keep it from falling out of the sky. For years, the public didn't even know the aircraft existed. Then there was tacit blue. Instead of sharp angles, tacit blue was curved and wide, with an intake on top. It looked so odd that it earned the nickname the Whale. Not exactly intimidating, but radar doesn't care if something looks cool. Tacit blue helped prove that curved shapes could hide too, and it influenced later stealth aircraft like the B-2 bomber. It flew 135 times between 1982 and 1985, and the public wasn't allowed to know it existed until 1996. Together, these programs flipped an old military idea. Instead of building something tough enough to survive being hit, engineers built something the enemy couldn't easily see in the first place. Sometimes the best armor isn't armor, it's a carefully controlled echo, but even an invisible aircraft still has a pilot inside it, and that means it can still be shot down. Number 3, Corona, catching pictures from space. Before digital cameras, a spy satellite had a ridiculous problem. It could take the picture, it just couldn't send the picture back. There was no streaming from orbit, no instant upload, no little satellite quietly emailing a file to Washington. The film was physically inside the satellite, flying around Earth. So Corona came up with a solution that sounds like a cartoon plan written by very serious people. The satellite would take photographs of the Soviet Union, seal the film inside a return capsule, and drop it back toward Earth under a parachute. Then a specially modified aircraft would try to catch the capsule in midair. The plane didn't just have a big net, it trailed a giant, trapeze-like grappling hook behind it. The pilot had to fly directly over the parachute to snag it with the hook, and then winch the capsule up into the cargo bay. The first attempts were a disaster. Rockets exploded, capsules were lost, cameras failed. The CIA couldn't risk Soviet ships finding the floating capsules, so the capsule was plugged with a block of compressed salt. If it hit the water, the salt would slowly dissolve over a couple of days, eventually flooding the capsule and sinking it to the bottom of the ocean. Then, in August 1960, one mission finally worked, and intelligence gathering changed overnight. That single bucket of film brought back more photographic coverage of the Soviet Union than every previous U-2 spy plane flight combined. One successful satellite pass could photograph territory that would have taken many dangerous manned flights to cover. It also revealed something politically explosive. The Soviet Union had far fewer strategic missiles than many American officials had feared. That quietly weakened claims of a missile gap that had shaped Cold War thinking. Corona's descendants eventually helped reshape mapping, agriculture, disaster response, and the entire idea that ordinary people could one day look at a picture of their own house from space. But photographs only show what's on the ground. Next up, a project that told almost everyone on Earth exactly where they were standing. Number 2, Navstar GPS, the invisible clock. You miss a turn. Your phone recalculates immediately, like it's disappointed but trying to stay professional. Then the wonders of modern technology confidently tell you to make a sharp left turn into a lake during a family road trip. It feels simple. It isn't. GPS was built for the military to provide accurate positioning and timing anywhere on Earth. And even though we think of it as a location system, it's really a time system first. Each satellite carries an extremely precise clock. It broadcasts where it is and exactly when the signal left. Your phone listens to signals from multiple satellites and compares the timing. Because radio waves travel at a known speed, your phone can work out how far away each satellite is. One satellite narrows your location to a huge sphere. A few more, and your position locks into place. That's the magic trick. Your phone isn't really asking, "Where am I?" It's asking, how late did these signals arrive? And the timing has to be absurdly precise. An error of only a few billionths of a second can create a real-world error of miles. In fact, the timing is so strict that engineers have to account for Albert Einstein's theory of relativity. Because the satellites are moving so fast and are so far from Earth's gravity, time literally moves at a different speed for them than it does for us. The clocks up there gain about 38 millionths of a second every single day compared to the ones down here. If nobody corrected for that, the system would drift so far off that it would be useless inside of a day. But why does your phone have access to a classified military targeting system? In 1983, a civilian passenger plane, Korean Airlines Flight 007, made a slight navigation error and accidentally drifted into Soviet airspace. A Soviet fighter jet shot it down, killing 269 people. In response, the US government announced that once GPS was finished, it would be opened up to the entire world for free, so a tragedy like that would never happen again. It took another decade to actually arrive. But that promise is the reason the thing in your pocket can talk to a military satellite constellation for nothing. Navigation is just the part we notice. GPS timing also helps synchronize financial transactions, power grids, communication networks, and scientific instruments across the planet. It's an invisible clock above your head right now, built for battlefields and quietly repurposed for daily life. And finally, this last project didn't just change where people could go, it changed where humanity stood in history. Number 1, the Manhattan Project, the secret that changed the world. During the Second World War, entire towns appeared behind guarded fences. At Oak Ridge, Tennessee, workers ran mysterious equipment without knowing what it produced. At Hanford, Washington, enormous reactors rose beside the Columbia River. At Los Alamos, New Mexico, some of the world's best scientists worked on a device no one had ever built before. The Manhattan Project wasn't just one lab. It was a sprawling, secret network of factories, military sites, universities, and tens of thousands of ordinary workers with the goal of creating the world's first atomic bomb. It was so heavily classified that the Vice President of the United States didn't even know it existed. Harry Truman only found out about the atomic bomb after the president died, and it was suddenly his job to decide whether to use it. But here's the ultimate irony of all those guarded fences. Soviet spies had infiltrated the project so deeply that Joseph Stalin actually knew about the American bomb before the American vice president did. Most people working on it only understood their tiny piece. Someone watched a gauge, someone inspected a pipe, someone ran calculations. Almost nobody could see the whole picture. That was the point. Compartmentalization helped keep the secret. It also meant thousands of people helped build a doomsday weapon without fully understanding what their work would become. On July 16, 1945, scientists gathered in the New Mexico desert for the Trinity test. The physics were so unprecedented that the engineers weren't entirely sure what would happen. As the story goes, the legendary physicist Enrico Fermi started taking bets on whether the blast would ignite the atmosphere and incinerate the entire planet. No official log records it, but enough people who were standing there remembered it happening. They pressed the button anyway. Then the horizon flashed. The heat was so intense it literally melted the desert sand into a radioactive green glass that had never existed on Earth before. Weeks later, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered soon after, but the argument over whether it had to happen that way has never really ended. The Manhattan Project didn't just build a weapon, it opened the nuclear age. So, how much of the modern world was built on secrets that were never supposed to come out? A lot more than most people realize. And the uncomfortable part is that secrecy helped make some of these breakthroughs possible, but it also hid the cost until turning back was no longer an option. That's the tension running through the whole list. Brilliance and abuse, innovation and fear, progress and silence, all protected by the same locked doors. Maybe the real lesson isn't just that these 10 projects existed, it's that history keeps proving the same thing. When powerful people decide something is safer in the dark, the world may not find out what was built until it's already living inside the consequences. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.